She screams, but no sound escapes. Not anymore. Not after 10,000 years. Her consciousness floats in an endless void, trapped within the writhing currents of the warp. The demon prince who captured her soul hasn't fed on it. That would be mercy. Instead, her essence is stretched across a lattice of crystallized pain, each facet reflecting her broken memories back at her in infinite recursion. The cold burn of psychic energy ripples across what used to be her skin. The smell of her own fear has become so familiar that she no longer recognizes it as abnormal. In the material realm, a space marine librarian touches the cursed artifact, her prison, and recoils. His fingers tremble against the cold ceramite of his gauntlet. "Emperor, protect us," he whispers, his voice like gravel. She's still aware in there, after all this time. The artifact pulses with a sickly amber glow, the color of ancient amber, the color of trapped things. Across the galaxy, a Dark Eldar homunculus slices into the flesh of his still-living canvas. The victim's nerve endings have been modified to experience pain 1,000-fold. Yet the homunculus considers this merely preliminary work. Death? He chuckles, the sound like glass breaking against stone. Death is the crude tool of the unimaginative. Beneath the surface of a forgotten moon, something that was once human scratches at the inside of its metal sarcophagus. Its mind long shattered, yet preserved by the cruel technology of the Necrons. Each second of its existence is an eternity of horror, as flesh and machine war for dominance within its form. It has forgotten its name. It has forgotten what species it once belonged to. But it remembers what it was like to die, and it prays for that release again. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, there are fates so horrifying that even the most battle-hardened warriors whisper prayers against them. Torments so absolute that the very concept of death becomes not a threat, but a desperate, unreachable hope. These are not quick executions or noble sacrifices. These are not tales of heroic last stands. These are the fates worse than death, the eternal punishments, the unending torments that break not just bodies, but souls themselves. And in a universe where gods feed on suffering and ancient beings play with mortal lives like discarded toys, these nightmares aren't just possible. They're happening right now, to countless souls across the stars. What terrors could be so absolute that the sweet release of oblivion becomes the most fervent prayer of the damned? In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, death is not the worst fate that awaits humanity. Death would be mercy. The Imperium of man spans millions of worlds, a rotting empire where trillions live and die without notice. But some souls are denied even this release. Chaos Space Marines, once the Emperor's finest warriors, now serve darker gods. They seek power through mutation, through flesh-changing gifts that warp their bodies into weapons of war. But the gods are fickle, and their gifts come with a price. When a warrior takes too many blessings, when ambition outpaces control, the changes accelerate beyond all reason. Bones snap and reform. Organs multiply and rupture. Consciousness remains trapped inside a body no longer recognizable as human. They become chaos spawn, writhing masses of tentacles, mouths, and eyes. Immortal abominations that can feel every moment of their eternal torment. The transformation is irreversible. No technology can restore them. No prayer can end their suffering. Their minds remain intact, just enough to understand what they've become, but not enough to end their own existence. This is the fate that haunts every follower of chaos. The price of failure, the punishment for hubris. In ancient human mythology, Prometheus was bound to a rock, his liver eaten daily by an eagle only to regenerate overnight, eternal punishment for his transgression against the gods. The Chaos gods have perfected this concept, turning warriors into monuments to their cruelty. What makes this fate so terrifying isn't just the physical agony. It's the loss of self while retaining just enough awareness to know what you once were. It's eternity spent as a mindless weapon, used by the very powers that condemned you. And yet, despite knowing this risk, thousands still pledge themselves to chaos each day. Such is the seductive promise of power in a universe where powerlessness means certain death. The Imperium teaches that death in service to the Emperor is the highest honor. But what they don't teach is that some fates are infinitely worse than a noble death. Some punishments transcend mortality itself. This is the story of those who suffer eternally in the 41st millennium, where there is only war, and where death is sometimes the kindest fate of all. But the transformation into a chaos spawn is just the beginning of our nightmare journey. There are fates that would make even these twisted abominations scream for the mercy of oblivion. The Drukhari don't want you dead. Death would be merciful. Inquisitor Dravus learned this truth as the barbed hook pierced his eyelid, the cold metal sliding against his cornea without puncturing it. A demonstration of precision. The pain receptors in his face fired like a million tiny novas. Yet the neural inhibitor kept him conscious, aware, unable to retreat into shock. Your kind measures suffering in minutes, in hours, the homunculus whispered, its breath smelling of chemical sweetness and something rotten beneath. We measure it in decades. The laboratory hummed with the soft whimpers of others suspended in various states of vivisection. The air tasted metallic, like blood atomized and suspended in the atmosphere. Every surface gleamed with an unnatural luster, designed to reflect the expressions of the tortured back at themselves. The Drukhari, the Dark Eldar, are a species that feeds on suffering. Not metaphorically, literally. Their immortal souls are constantly being drained by their god, and only the psychic energy of others' agony can replenish them. The hook retracted with a wet sound, and Dravus felt a warm trickle down his cheek. Not blood. Tears mixed with some clear fluid from inside his eye. You wonder how long you've been here, the homunculus said, reading his thoughts with disturbing accuracy. 16 Terran days. Your body would have died 14 days ago. But we've kept it alive. The worst part wasn't the pain. It was knowing that the Dark Eldar had perfected this craft over millennia. The homunculi could rebuild a human from a single cell, regenerating them countless times to begin the torture anew. Some captives had been kept alive for centuries, their minds fracturing and reforming in endless cycles of trauma. Dravus had seen the chambers where they kept their oldest specimens. Humans whose bodies had been remade so many times, they barely resembled anything human at all. Nervous systems externalized, wrapped around frames of bone and metal. Conscious, always conscious. The floor beneath the torture rack vibrated subtly, a sign that somewhere in this vast, twisted city, a raid was returning with fresh captives. The homunculus turned, distracted for a moment. The rejuvenation process will begin tomorrow, it said, its voice like silk sliding over broken glass. Your pain will sustain one of our archons for perhaps a week. Then we'll need to intensify things. Dravus tried to speak, but his jaw had been removed 3 days ago. The homunculus understood anyway. No, Inquisitor. Your Imperium doesn't know you're here. No one is coming. And even if they did. The creature leaned closer, its face a mask of surgical scars and augmentations, eyes like bottomless wells. We would simply move you deeper into the webway, where time flows differently, where I could spend a century working on just your nervous system while only days pass in your realm. The homunculus pressed something cold against Dravis's temple. Now, let's explore your memories of your children. I find familial love creates the most exquisite pain when properly leveraged. And as the device activated, Dravis realized the most horrifying truth. His soul would eventually break, but the Dark Eldar would never let it escape. They had technology to capture it, to bind it, to torture it directly. Death would never come. Not even after his body was nothing but component parts. The warp doesn't just kill you, it doesn't just torture you, it consumes you, piece by infinitesimal piece, turning your very essence into a form of currency in a realm where suffering is the only legal tender. Consider navigator Halia Voss, whose gifted bloodline carried the mutation, allowing Imperial ships to traverse the Imperium. For 9 generations, her family served with distinction, guiding vessels through the treacherous currents of the warp, until the day her ship's Geller field flickered, just for 2.7 seconds, long enough for something to notice her, something hungry. The first sensation, recorded her ship's astropath before his own madness took him, was cold. Not the cold of void space, but the cold of absence, as if warmth itself became a forgotten concept. Halia felt it enter through her third eye, the navigator's mutation that allowed her to perceive the warp. The membrane between realities tore like wet parchment. The thing that entered wasn't a demon in the traditional sense. It was a collector, a harvester. The process began slowly. Crew members reported hearing Halia speaking in perfect harmony with herself. Multiple voices, all hers, emerging simultaneously from her throat. Her skin developed a translucent quality, revealing not organs, but swirling patterns beneath, like oil in water. By the third day, the navigator's quarters had to be sealed. The bulkheads themselves seemed to sweat in her presence, beads of moisture that smelled of copper and honey forming on metal surfaces. Recording devices captured her conversations, with herself, with entities no one else could see, with people long dead. "I'm becoming currency," she told the ship's commissar during his final authorized visit. Every memory, every emotion, every dream, it's being rendered down, quantified, and prepared for transaction. The commissar raised his bolt pistol then. It would have been mercy. But his finger wouldn't pull the trigger. Not because he lacked courage, but because Halia was no longer entirely there to kill. Parts of her consciousness had already been parceled out, sold in fragments to entities that collect such things like aristocrats collect rare wines. Her physical form remained aboard the vessel for another 17 days. 17 days of transformation as her soul stuff was rendered into what the Ordo Malleus would later classify as empiric tender, spiritual currency used by warp entities to trade portions of power and influence among themselves. Inquisitorial records indicate that fragments of navigator Halia Voss have been identified in no fewer than 27 subsequent demonic manifestations across 3 sectors. Each manifestation exhibited some characteristic unique to Halia: her distinctive laugh, her knowledge of ancient Terran poetry, her fear of drowning. She exists now as spiritual small change, scattered across countless transactions in the Imperium. Not dead, not alive, spent like coins from a purse, yet somehow still aware each time another piece of her changes hands. And the most terrifying truth? The Ordo Malleus estimates that thousands of souls are similarly consumed each year, their essence rendered into currency in a marketplace where demons and gods trade in the fragments of what was once human. But what makes Hyalia's case uniquely disturbing isn't just her fate. It's that Imperial psychics can still sometimes hear her voice in the warp, whispering a single, impossible plea. Please, find the rest of me. The Space Marine's screams echoed through the corrupted cathedral as his body began to betray him. Once a proud warrior of the Emperor, now a plaything of the Chaos Gods. Please, kill me, he begged, his voice distorting as his vocal cords stretched and multiplied within his throat. The sickly, sweet smell of rotting fruit filled the air, the signature scent of Nurgle's blessing. It had begun with a single mutation, an extra finger that sprouted during warp travel. Small enough to hide beneath his gauntlet, insignificant enough to ignore, fatal enough to doom him. His battle brothers would have executed him immediately had they known. A merciful bolt round to the head. But pride kept him silent. Pride delivered him to this fate worse than death. The Chaos Sorcerer circled him, breathing in the agony like fine incense. The gods have rejected your form, Astartes. They find it limiting. The Marine's armor, once midnight blue, now bulged and cracked as the flesh beneath expanded in impossible directions. Bones snapped with wet popping sounds as they reformed into new configurations. His skin bubbled like wax held over flame. Your consciousness will remain, the sorcerer explained, running a clawed finger along the Marine's distorting cheek. Trapped within a body that no longer obeys, unable to speak, unable to die. But oh, how you'll remember who you once were. Through tears of blood, the Marine watched his left arm split into 3 writhing tentacles, each tipped with gnashing mouths. The pain was beyond comprehension, nerve endings multiplying and firing simultaneously as his DNA rewrote itself in real time. His memories remained intact, the noble aspirations of youth, the pride of his induction, the honor of serving the Emperor, all preserved within a mind now housed in abomination. The transformation to spawn is the ultimate failure, the sorcerer continued, his voice a rasping whisper. You sought power, but lacked control. The gods give, and then they take. Everything, except your awareness. A mirror was brought forth, held before what remained of the Marine's face, now a cluster of eyes arranged around a vertical maw. He tried to scream, but produced only a gurgling howl as his lungs divided and reshaped. Worse than the physical agony was the psychic pain. His mind remained lucid enough to understand what he was becoming, a mindless, formless thing, a chaos spawn, immortal, unkillable, forever mutating. His final coherent thought slipped away as his brain tissue liquefied and reformed. The last remnant of the proud warrior dissolved into the roiling mass of flesh and mutation. And yet, consciousness persisted. Centuries would pass. Millennia, perhaps. His body would continue its endless transformation, growing limbs only to absorb them, developing organs with no purpose, bones that shattered and reformed, never finding stability, never knowing peace. There would be moments of terrible clarity amidst the madness. Brief windows where he would remember his name, his honor, his fall. These moments of awareness were not mercy. They were the cruelest part of his eternal sentence. For the chaos gods ensure one truth above all others. Those who fail them never escape into death's release. And somewhere in the twisted mass of what he had become, a single human thought remained, repeating endlessly like a broken Vox transmission. The Emperor cannot save me now. But the true horror? This was just one of the 3 fates that awaited those who failed the dark gods. The screams echoed through the ossified corridors, not desperate pleas for mercy, but the hollow wails of those who had forgotten what mercy even was. Captain Darius of the Imperial Guard had been in Dark Eldar captivity for what his broken mind calculated as 17 years. Time had no meaning in the lightless chambers of the homunculi covens. The chronometer on his shattered Vox unit still functioned, a deliberate cruelty by his captors, ticking away seconds of a life that should have ended long ago. "Pain is merely the beginning," whispered Zandrath, the ancient homunculus, whose spindly fingers were stained with fluids that had once flowed through Darius's body. "Death is a gift I will never grant you." The air tasted of copper and chemical preservatives, a nauseating mixture that coated Darius's tongue even when they weren't forcing elixirs down his throat. His skin had been removed and regrown 17 times. He remembered each procedure with perfect clarity. Another gift from the regenerative serums that kept his mind intact while his body was systematically unmade. The worst wasn't the physical agony. It was the knowledge that his soul would never escape. "Do you know why we value human specimens so highly?" Zandrath had asked during the early years, his voice a silken caress against Darius's exposed nerve endings. "Your souls lack the resilience of Eldar spirits. They fracture so beautifully under prolonged suffering." Darius had seen it happen to others. The soul-breaking. Humans kept alive for centuries, their essences gradually splintering into crystalline fragments that the homunculi harvested like precious gems. These soul shards were then embedded into living flesh, sometimes the victim's own, creating symphonies of agony that the Dark Eldar fed upon. The temperature dropped suddenly. Frost formed on the exposed bone of Darius's ribcage. They had opened him again while he slept. The cold was new, an innovation. "Today we begin the Marahedron process," Zandrath announced to his apprentices who gathered around the slab. "The human will experience every death he has ever feared, simultaneously, within a single moment stretched across eternity." Darius tried to scream, but his vocal cords had been removed. Instead, he heard the wet, slithering sound of something being inserted into the cavity where his lungs had been. "The soul engine requires anchoring," Zandrath explained, holding up a pulsating crystalline device. "Once implanted, it creates a pocket dimension within the subject's consciousness. There, they will experience their own personal hell, tailored precisely to their deepest terrors." Darius felt the device touch something beyond his physical form, something fundamental to his being. In that moment, he understood with horrifying clarity. His soul was being folded into itself, creating an infinite recursion of suffering. The last thing he saw before his physical eyes were removed was Zandrath's face, eyes glittering with anticipation. "Your agony will feed us for millennia," the homunculus whispered. "And the most exquisite part? Your Imperium believes you died gloriously in battle 17 years ago. No one is coming to save you." But as the soul engine activated, Darius realized the true horror wasn't that no one would save him. It was that there would soon be nothing left of him to save. In the darkest corners of the 41st millennium, where reality bleeds into madness, there exists a fate so horrific that Imperial scholars are forbidden from documenting it fully: the consumption of a soul by the raw energies of the warp. Imagine your consciousness, not just your body, but the very essence of who you are, being slowly unraveled like wet parchment, strand by agonizing strand. The process begins with a cold whisper that crawls across your skin, raising goosebumps as reality itself begins to peel away. The body dies in seconds, explains Inquisitor Karamazov's forbidden texts. The soul's torment lasts for what feels like millennia. Unlike the Emperor's mercy of oblivion and death, those consumed by the warp remain aware, fully, horrifically aware. Their screams echo in a dimension where sound has taste and pain has color, a prismatic agony beyond human comprehension. Witnesses who've glimpsed warp breaches describe the smell as electricity mixed with rotting meat, the scent of reality itself decomposing. Survivors report hearing the victims' screams long after they've disappeared, the sound somehow continuing to vibrate through solid matter for days. But here lies the true horror. The dissolution isn't simply destruction. It's transformation. We thought we were saving them, whispered astropath Kine before her execution for heresy. All those years trying to rescue souls from the warp. But what if that's exactly where the dark gods wanted them? The Ordo Malleus has suppressed this revelation for millennia. Those consumed don't simply vanish. Their consciousness becomes building material, living, suffering components absorbed into the architecture of the Imperium itself. Each soul stretched across the infinite, experiencing every possible permutation of agony simultaneously. Think of the mathematics. A single human mind contains approximately 100 trillion neural connections. When dissolved in the warp, each connection becomes a separate locus of awareness, each experiencing its own unique torture, yet still connected to the whole. 100 trillion individual hells, all experienced simultaneously for what feels like eternity. The cruelest twist? Those consumed often believe they're being saved, the light. It's so beautiful, were the final recorded words of Navigator Horace Vale before a Geller field failure consumed him and his entire crew. The Emperor comes for us at last, but what if the Emperor isn't their savior in those final moments? What if the light that seems to welcome them is something far more sinister, a predator's lure in the cosmic dark? More disturbing still are the accounts of Imperial psychers who claim to recognize the consciousness fragments of lost colleagues, still aware, still screaming, woven into the fabric of the warp centuries after their supposed deaths. And perhaps most chilling, the theory that the Emperor himself, bound to the Golden Throne for 10,000 years, experiences a version of this torment daily. His psychic might stretched across the galaxy, his consciousness fragmented across dimensions, experiencing the suffering of trillions. But if the master of mankind endures this fate to protect humanity, what happens when he finally fails? The true nature of the warp isn't just that it consumes souls, it's that it preserves them, trapped in a state of eternal, conscious dissolution. Forever dying, never dead. And somewhere in that swirling madness, fragments of consciousness that were once human watch new souls arrive and remember what it was like to scream. What makes these fates truly unbearable isn't the physical pain. It's the psychological torture that never ends. Imagine being fully conscious as your body is transformed into a chaos spawn. Your mind remains intact, while your flesh bubbles and reforms like hot wax under a flame. Limbs sprout where they shouldn't, eyes open across your torso, but you can't scream. Your mouth has sealed shut, replaced by writhing tentacles. One former guardsman, now a mass of twitching flesh, still retains enough of his mind to understand what he's become. Imperial records captured his last coherent thoughts. I feel everything. I am awake inside this prison. Emperor, save me. The worst part? You're still you. Demonhood offers no escape either. Those elevated to demonhood retain their consciousness while becoming slaves to their patron god's whims. The burning sensation of your soul being rewritten never fades. It intensifies with each passing century. As 1,000 Sun Sorcerer described it, my thoughts echo in chambers that never existed before. I taste colors. I hear the screams of stars dying, and I cannot close my eyes, for they are everywhere now. But perhaps most disturbing is the fate of those interred in a dreadnought. Imagine being a space marine hero, mortally wounded in battle. You wake up, if you can call it waking, entombed in a sarcophagus of cold adamantium. The bitter taste of recycled nutrients floods your mouth through feeding tubes. Your only sensory input comes through artificial interfaces that reduce the world to targeting data and tactical assessments. One Blood Angel's dreadnought described his existence. I drift in and out of consciousness. Sometimes I'm in battle, feeling the recoil of my weapons. Sometimes I'm back on Baal before my transformation. But mostly, I float in darkness. Years pass like heartbeats, centuries like breaths, and I cannot die. The Dark Eldar have perfected this psychological torture to an art form. Their homunculi can keep a victim alive for millennia, their nervous system constantly regenerating to ensure maximum pain reception. The victim's minds eventually shatter, but the homunculi are skilled at piecing them back together just so they can break again. What makes these fates truly worse than death is the preservation of identity. In each case, you remain aware enough to know what you once were, to remember your humanity, to understand what you've lost. As a captured Inquisitor wrote before his transformation into a chaos spawn, "Death is the Emperor's mercy. What awaits me is the absence of mercy. I will be conscious, I will know, and I will remember being human." The most horrifying aspect isn't the physical transformation. It's the psychological awareness that remains. The knowledge that you are trapped forever, conscious of your fate, unable to end your suffering. And perhaps most terrifying of all, some of these victims eventually stop wanting to die. They forget what it means to be human. They accept their new existence. And that, perhaps, is the true horror. Not that they suffer eternally, but that after enough time, they stop recognizing it as suffering at all. But what happens when these tormented souls finally encounter those they once loved? From the journals of Inquisitor Voke, we learn of Commissar Tadian, a decorated officer whose valor on 100 battlefields earned him the respect of even the most hardened Astartes. But valor means nothing to the dark gods. Tadian's descent began with whispers, soft, seductive promises that slithered into his dreams. The voices offered power beyond measure, if only he would accept their gifts. I thought I was strong enough. His final picked recording confesses, his skin already beginning to ripple beneath his uniform. Emperor, forgive me. The transformation of a human into a chaos spawn is not swift. It is agonizingly deliberate. Each mutation is a reward from patrons who view mercy as weakness. First came the bones. They softened like wax in a furnace, bending and twisting beneath his skin. Tadian's screams echoed through the ship's brig as his ribcage split open, revealing pulsating organs that should never see light. The worst part, explains former apothecary Niels Corvin, is that the victim remains conscious. Their mind stays intact long after their humanity is gone. Tadian's flesh bubbled and stretched, his uniform tearing as limbs multiplied at impossible angles. Eyes formed in clusters across what had once been his torso, each blinking independently, each seeing a different fragment of reality. The smell is what most witnesses remember, a nauseating blend of rotting meat and chemical burn that clings to the nostrils for weeks after exposure. The wet, slapping sounds of malformed appendages dragging across metal decking. The constant mewling cries that somehow still carry human inflection. But physical transformation is merely the beginning of this living nightmare. Spawn retain fragments of their former selves, explains Radical Inquisitor Heimdall, enough to understand what they've become, but not enough to end their own suffering. Imagine being trapped in a body that no longer obeys you, a prison of flesh that constantly shifts and reforms. Your mind, your soul, still aware as your form violates every natural law, and the hunger, the endless, gnawing hunger that can never be satisfied. The Ordo Malleus maintains specimens for study. In containment cell Delta 7, a creature that was once Captain Alaric has survived for 73 years. Its metabolism altered to prevent death, even as it begs for release with sounds no human throat should produce. We've recorded instances of recognition, notes Magos biologist Farron. When confronted with family members or battle brothers, some specimens display behaviors suggesting awareness of their former identity. The cruelest aspect: chaos. Spawn cannot die naturally. Their warped bodies regenerate from injuries that would obliterate normal life forms. They exist in perpetual agony until destroyed by force. In the depths of the harrowing warp storm, an entire planet of these abominations roams free. The screaming world of Coquitos, where billions of transformed souls writhe across its surface like maggots on rotting flesh. Tadion's final words, before his jaw dislocated and reformed into something inhuman. I can still see through these eyes. All of them. I can still feel. Emperor, help me. I can still feel everything. But the Emperor cannot hear their prayers. Not anymore. And somewhere in the darkness between stars, the dark gods laugh at their newest playthings. In the deepest recesses of Commorragh, the dark city of the Dark Eldar, time itself becomes an instrument of torture. Former guardsman Lauren Corvus discovered this truth when raiders descended upon his mining outpost in the dead of night. The air crackled with energy as the Dark Eldar emerged from their webway portals. Not the clean, cauterizing heat of last fire, but the sick, acrid smell of weapons designed specifically to maximize pain without killing. Nerve disruptors, agonizers, tools crafted by beings who had refined suffering into an art form over millennia. They moved like shadows between heartbeats, recalled the only survivor of the raid. One moment the corridor was empty, the next filled with these elegant monsters, their armor adorned with bones and flayed skin that still glistened wet. Corvus was taken alive. They all were. Death would have been a mercy the Dark Eldar had no interest in providing. In Commorragh, human captives serve one primary purpose: to feed the Dark Eldar's insatiable hunger for suffering. Their immortal souls are slowly consumed by Slaanesh, and only by inflicting extreme pain and terror on others can they replenish their essence. The homunculi, whispers an inquisitorial report, are perhaps the most terrifying of all Dark Eldar. Flesh sculptors who have transcended death itself, they reshape living bodies into grotesque works of art that somehow continue to live and feel every moment of their transformation. Corvus was kept conscious as they peeled back his skin, layer by layer. The sensation of cool, recycled air on exposed muscle fibers sent waves of agony through his nervous system, carefully calibrated by drugs that heightened sensitivity while preventing shock or unconsciousness. But this was merely the beginning. Dark Eldar captivity isn't measured in days or months. It's measured in transformations. Some captives become grotesques, mindless, muscle-bound abominations whose bodies have been pumped full of growth stimulants and combat drugs. Others become living art installations, nervous systems kept alive while bodies are contorted into impossible shapes. The smell of chemical preservatives mingles with the metallic tang of blood in the homunculi laboratories. The walls themselves pulse with a sickly rhythm. Lined with still living tissue harvested from countless victims, we recovered one of the captives. States Inquisitor Vale's classified report. What remained could no longer be called human. The subject's pain receptors had been modified to transmit at 20 times normal human capacity. Its vocal cords had been altered to produce sounds beyond the normal human register, presumably to create novel forms of screaming. The most horrifying aspect? Dark Eldar technology can extend life far beyond its natural span. Their regeneration techniques can repair virtually any damage, not to heal, but to prepare the subject for fresh torments. A captive might endure this for decades, centuries even. The lucky ones eventually lose their minds completely. The truly damned retain just enough awareness to comprehend what they've become, trapped in bodies no longer recognizable as their own, experiencing sensations that the human nervous system was never designed to process. Corvus's final recorded words, scratched into the wall of his holding cell before his final transformation. Emperor, I beg you, not for salvation, for an end. But in the dark laboratories of Commorragh, even death offers no escape. For the homunculi have mastered the art of resurrection, ensuring their favorite specimens can experience the exquisite agony of death again and again and again. How many times can a soul break before nothing remains? No screams escape the void. No prayers are answered in the endless dark between realities. This is the fate of those consumed by the warp, perhaps the most terrifying destiny imaginable in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. When a human soul is devoured by the Imperium, it doesn't simply cease to exist. That would be mercy. Instead, it becomes eternal sustenance for the hungering entities that dwell beyond the veil of reality. They feel everything, whispered Inquisitor Karamazov, his fingers trembling as they traced the ancient text. Every moment of their consumption, stretched across infinity. The warp exists outside conventional time. A second there might be an eternity of agony. A soul caught in its churning tides experiences every possible permutation of suffering simultaneously. Past, present, and future collapse into a single point of endless torment. Consider the fate of navigator Elias Winters. When his ship, the Imperial cruiser Righteous Fury, suffered a catastrophic Geller field failure during warp transit, 5,000 souls were exposed to raw immaterium. All died instantly, except Elias. His mutated pineal eye, the very organ that allowed him to navigate the treacherous currents of the warp, became his curse. It kept him conscious as demon entities peeled away his physical form, layer by layer, savoring each moment of his terror. The rescue team that eventually recovered the drifting vessel found only his head, somehow still alive, eyes wide with a horror beyond comprehension. His mouth moved ceaselessly, though no sound emerged. His consciousness had been stretched across dimensions, experiencing millennia of consumption in what had been mere hours in real space. He's still there. The ship's astropath later committed to record before taking her own life. I can hear him screaming across the void. He will always be there. This I, Ask the nature of warp consumption. The demons of the Imperium feed not just on flesh, but on consciousness itself. They pull apart the very essence of a person, their memories, hopes, fears, and feast upon each fragment individually, while ensuring the core awareness remains intact to experience it all. Unlike other fates in the dark future, there is no adaptation to this horror. No growing numb to the pain. Each moment is experienced with the same raw intensity as the first. The mind cannot collapse into madness because the warp sustains it, keeping it painfully lucid throughout eternity. And the cruelest truth? Those consumed are never truly gone. They exist in a state of perpetual dissolution, never completely devoured, never permitted the peace of oblivion. Their essence becomes part of the warp itself, fuel for its nightmares, whispers in its storms. Imperial doctrine teaches that the God Emperor protects the souls of the faithful. But in the darkness between stars, in the screaming madness of the Imperium, even his light seems impossibly distant. In the crushing darkness of the void, trillions pray they will simply die when their time comes, because they know there are fates infinitely worse than death. And in the swirling insanity of the warp, those consumed souls continue to scream, their torment feeding the very horrors that devour them in an endless cycle of suffering that transcends time itself. But what if consumption isn't the worst fate the warp offers? To understand true horror is to understand ourselves. The three fates we've witnessed aren't simply torture. They are annihilation of self in its most profound sense. The Dark Eldar's flesh sculpting doesn't just reshape bone and sinew. It rewires the very neural pathways of pain. Victims experience agony so exquisite, so precisely calibrated, that the mind fractures into 1,000 screaming pieces. Each one aware, each one begging for a death that will never come. The sound of their own heartbeat becomes a countdown to the next wave of suffering. Consider this. Pain has a ceiling in normal human experience. But Dark Eldar homunculi have mapped the topology of suffering for millennia. They've discovered how to reset that ceiling again and again, creating infinite staircases of agony that ascend forever. The cold metal scent of the torture chambers mingles with the copper tang of blood, creating a sensory prison from which there is no mental escape. With chaos possession, the violation cuts deeper still. Your body becomes a window through which you watch, helpless as your hands commit atrocities. Parents forced to murder children, warriors made to betray everything they once defended. The demon doesn't simply control, it savors your horror, feeding on the dissonance between your screaming conscience and your compliant flesh. The texture of your own skin becomes alien, crawling with sensations not your own. Your voice speaks words you'd never utter, and all the while, you remain conscious, a passenger in the vehicle of your desecrated self. But perhaps most insidious is the servitor's fate, the grinding mechanical sounds of augmetics replacing human tissue, the chemical burn of synaptic rewiring. The temperature drops as more flesh is replaced with cold metal. Your memories, the very fabric of who you are deemed inefficient and purged. Yet somewhere, buried beneath layers of programming, something of you remains. A fragment, a whisper, enough to know what you've lost. These horrors terrify us because they target what we value most: our autonomy, our identity, our capacity to end suffering through death. They are the systematic dismantling of personhood, while consciousness remains to witness its own undoing. In our world today, we glimpse shadows of these horrors. Digital identities hijacked, bodies medicalized without consent, minds manipulated through algorithms designed to reshape thought. The line between person and product grows thinner. We fear these Warhammer fates because they are grotesque reflections of anxieties already within us. The terror of losing control, of being trapped in our own flesh, of having our suffering monetized and our identity erased. What would you sacrifice to maintain the sanctity of self? How much autonomy have you already surrendered without realizing it? The darkness of the 41st millennium casts long shadows backward through time, landing squarely in our present. Every click surrenders data. Every view shapes algorithms. Every moment we look away, something essential is quietly being extracted, not with knives or scalpels, but with terms of service we never read. If these stories haunt your thoughts, perhaps that's exactly what you need. Subscribe now, and remember, in darkness, we sometimes see most clearly. We've journeyed through the darkest corners of the 41st millennium. 3 fates so horrifying that death would be a merciful release. 3 nightmares that will follow you into your dreams. The Dark Eldar's victims, flesh sculpted into living art, screaming for millennia as their nerve endings are kept raw and exposed. Their consciousness trapped in a perpetual state of agony, unable to die, unable to escape. The cold metal bodies of those drafted into the Necron legions, their souls bound to machines, their memories fading like morning dew under a merciless sun. The slow, inexorable erosion of everything that once made them who they were. And the chosen of Nurgle, their bodies bloated and festering, teeming with maggots that never consume them fully. Feeling every squirming movement beneath skin that splits and heals in an endless cycle of decay and rebirth. Perhaps what disturbs us most is not the physical torment, though the screams would shatter your sanity if you heard them. No, it's the psychological horror that truly haunts. The knowledge that there is no end, no release, no final darkness to welcome you home. In each case, consciousness persists. Awareness remains. The mind, that fragile thing we call the self, is forced to endure what the body cannot. Pain is just information. The homunculus would whisper, his breath carrying the coppery scent of fresh blood. But information without purpose becomes torture. Existence without meaning becomes hell. We recoil from these fates because they violate something fundamental to the human experience. The promise that suffering ends, that no matter how terrible things become, death will eventually grant peace. But in the grim darkness of the far future, even this small mercy is denied. Look around our world today. We create our own endless torments. Social media algorithms designed to keep us engaged through outrage and fear. Technologies that blur the line between human and machine. Medical advances that extend life without ensuring its quality. Are we not, in our own way, creating conditions where consciousness continues beyond its natural limits? Where suffering is prolonged because we fear the alternative? What price would you pay for immortality if you knew it came with eternal awareness? Would you still reach for it, knowing what awaits in the dark future of mankind? These questions haunt the corridors of the 41st millennium, echoing through time to reach us here. They whisper of fates worse than death that may one day become our reality. If this journey through the darkest corners of the Warhammer universe has left you disturbed yet craving more, then you already understand the pull of the forbidden knowledge. Subscribe and join us as we continue to explore the most terrifying aspects of existence. After all, in the face of eternal torment, isn't shared horror our only comfort?